3 roses. Joe Davis was a miller by trade. As jolly a miller as you could hope to meet. The sort who would stand you a beer, tell you a joke, and help you out in times of trouble. No one ever complained that Joe held back some of their flour, or that he grumbled if you only brought 1 sack of corn to be ground. "He's a right good 'un," was the general verdict. He had been looking for a mill to rent for some time, but hadn't been able to find one cheap enough. Mills were valuable property, often owned by wealthy men who wanted a good income from them. One day he heard of a mill at the foot of the Wolds that was being let at a ridiculously low price. He leapt at the chance, and soon agreed a very good deal with the owner, a big, bluff man who seemed delighted with his new tenant. He kept shaking Joe by the hand and saying, "Good man, good man." The watermill stood in a hollow at the Wolds, surrounded by trees, but a delightful place on a sunny day. It was rather more dilapidated than Joe had expected, and seemed to have been empty for some time, but his merry wife and 3 boisterous children, Joe's delight, soon filled its rooms with laughter. And so, not being a man much given to deep thought, he didn't let it worry him. It took a while to fettle the machinery, adjust the grindstones, and repair the great water wheel. Soon its comforting deep rumble was the background to their lives. Joe worked hard for a couple of weeks without going into the village, but a few neighbours dropped in to welcome the new family. "Good luck, Mr. Davis," said one. "Thou must be a brave man." "Brave? How? Doesn't thou know?" continued the neighbour, exchanging meaningful glances with friends he had brought with him. "Surely thou must know. Surely someone must have said something." "Told me what?" Joe was growing a little annoyed. The neighbour sucked his teeth importantly and put on a long face. "The mill's haunted." Joe laughed out loud with relief. "Is that a? Dinna that worry, man," he said. "Me and me wife will be a match for any boggles. I thought thou was talking of woodworm." The neighbours left in a huff. Others came visiting over the next week and said much the same thing, but Joe laughed it off. "Trouble with folks hereabouts, Mary," he told his wife, "is they've got too little to worry about." The mill showed no sign of being haunted that summer. The water wheel rumbled, the stones ground sweetly, and the children ran about happily and did not fall into the mill race. The sun shone, and the birds sang. The miller sang too. He was a great singer, with a sweet voice for such a big man. He sang at his work all day, particularly the song with which he had wooed his wife, the Rose of Tralee. She was lovely and fair as the rose of the summer, filled the warm air as the children ran about. When autumn came, and the sun grew lower, the valley where the mill stood grew a little more gloomy. Wind sighed through the cracks in the dark timbers, leaves floated on the mill race. The miller's wife built up a good fire in the parlour. She had finally got it to her taste, shining with polished brass, smelling of polished wood, a comfortable chair for the tired miller, and embroidered cushions on the long settle for the rest of the family. There were china dogs among the candlesticks on the mantelpiece, and over it hung her pride and joy, a portrait of herself that the miller had had painted for their 6th wedding anniversary. It showed her standing in the garden in the blue dress she had worn at her wedding. In her hand she held 3 red roses, one for each of their children. The miller had paid a lot of money to the artist for it, and it was held to be a very good likeness. For the miller's wife, however, it was a symbol of her husband's love. She valued it above all her possessions. One evening, the tea-cloth had been drawn, and the children were, for once, quietly reading by the fire. The miller's wife was sitting near them at her endless task of mending. The miller was in his chair, comfortably tired after a long day. His head sank back as he dozed off. For a while, there was no sound, but the distant rumbling of the water wheel, the ticking of the long case clock, and the crackling of the fire. The miller's wife smiled to herself. It was one of those moments of peace that make up for all the drudgery of the day. She felt her own eyes begin to close. Suddenly, the miller started up, wide awake, his eyes staring, his face as white as his own flour. "What's up, love?" asked his wife. He did not reply, but walked from the room like a man dazed. From that day onwards, Joe Davis changed. No longer the jolly miller. He never sang at his work any more, or laughed with the children. He moved around at his work with a distracted air, and often failed to respond when people spoke to him. His wife, shocked at the sudden change, tried at first to ignore it, giving him time to get over whatever trouble he was in, or at the very least, get up enough courage to tell her of it. But his misery seemed to deepen day by day. No longer did the neighbours drop in for a chat when they brought their wheat to be ground. Instead, they shuffled nervously and looked out the windows. When they spoke to the miller's wife, they were unnecessarily solicitous. One woman even flung her arms around her in a big hug, and when she let go, there were tears in her eyes. The autumn deepened into winter. Silence and gloom deepened in the mill. The children, increasingly disturbed, dawdled on the way home from school, putting off getting back to that cheerless place. They were not fooled by their mother's forced gaiety. The rumble of the water wheel, which had always seemed so comforting, suddenly seemed threatening. A danger creeping towards them. Still, the miller said nothing of his trouble. He avoided his family, finding unnecessary work to keep him out of the way. Then, one raw November night, the miller's wife could bear it no longer. The millstones stood still, for there was little to grind at that time of year. But the fire in the parlour was burning as brightly as ever, and the children were safely in bed. The miller had eaten his tea in silence and immediately gone out again, muttering something about the wheel. Usually his wife would have taken herself off to bed, but this night she was determined, and waited up to have it out with him. It was very late when she heard his slow step on the stairs, he who had always run everywhere. And then he was in the room, holding his cold hands out to the fire. He startled when he saw her, but quickly she was between him and the door. Sorrow filled her as his drawn face turned towards her. "Tell me. For God's sake, tell me what's wrong. Have you lost all our money? Are you ill? Tell me. I must know." She saw him struggle with himself. Then a curious blankness seemed to overcome him. "It was a painting," he said dully. "It was a painting. That night." "What night, love? Tell me." "That night, when I suddenly started up. I had nigh fallen asleep. Then I had a vision or something. I was still in my chair, but a sort of shadow of me rose up out of my chest, walked over to the fire, and looked up at the painting." He paused and rubbed his forehead with his hands. Then me, the shadow, reached up his hand and touched the 3 roses in the painting. They were real, somehow, as well as being painted, and then... His flat voice ceased. Suddenly she didn't want him to go on. It was just a dream, my love. No, but a dream. No call to be frightened. But he began again, drearily grinding out the words. I touched the roses, and they all faded. The petals just shriveled up and fell off. Then he touched your blue dress, and all the colour faded. No, stop, now! And your face went all grey and old. That's it, love. That's it. I made you all die. She couldn't speak. The spell of the horrible words struck her dumb. Go to bed, love, said her husband gently. Now, I have one more thing to do. Go to bed. Without another look at her, he left the room, and she heard his boots once again going down the stairs. Left alone, she tried to shake herself free of fear. It was just a dream. What harm is there in a dream? That's a foolish old woman, she told herself, but she felt in need of a cup of tea, nevertheless. The kettle hanging by the fire was never empty, and soon she had brewed herself a strong cup. She sat in her usual place by the fire, but she found no peace there. Against her will, she found her eyes straying upwards towards the picture. The 3 red roses were as beautifully painted as ever. There was even a realistic drop of dew on one of them that she had always admired, though now she thought it looked more like a tear. The blue dress, torn up for dusters long ago, but lovely cloth, was unchanged, and her face tea-splashed as the cup broke on the hearth. Staring out at her from her own face were eyes filled with a hideous malevolence. The painted lips now curved upwards in a mocking smile. At that very moment, the miller's wife heard a voice. Her husband's voice, singing outside. She ran to the window and flung it open. On the frosty air, the song rang out, loud and clear. She was lovely and fair as the rose of the summer, but 'twas not her beauty alone that won me. Oh no, 'twas the truth in her eyes ever dawning, that made me love Mary, the Rose of Tralee. Then, with a great groaning of timbers, the millstones began to turn, shaking the house, grinding nothing. See her standing there, Mary, the miller's wife, her hand on the window catch. Only one thought fills her head, one unreasonable but terrible thought. The children are not safe. She grabs a candle, blunders across the room, see the eyes of the portrait follow her, and begins to climb the steep stairs to the children's attic. It is a long way up, and, as in a nightmare, there seems to be a weight on her limbs that fights her every step. She has only reached the landing when she hears a voice from above. Her little boy's voice, drowsy with sleep. "Oh, Daddy, how cold you are! How very cold you are!" She cannot move. The candle falls from her hand. Darkness covers her. It's said that that's how they found her the next morning, the men who came with corn to grind. She was sitting on the stairs, her eyes blank, her wits quite gone. In the attic lay her 3 children, dead in their beds, not a mark on them. It's a blessing she knows nought about this. said one, as they hauled the body of the miller out of the mill race. The other men shook their heads and said nothing. The mill was torn down shortly after. No one would rent it. The portrait was burned. Who wants a picture of the grey woman holding 3 dead roses anyway?